Well, thank you for sticking around for the afternoon session. You will notice that if you dig into your book that my presentation's not in there, and I have to apologize, it's a little slow getting that out, but I do have copies of it if anybody needs one. Okay, so I'll leave them down here or pass them out here in a little bit. But just wanted to spend some time here and visit about corn management, and but I wanted to start out talking about what happened in 2016. Some of you guys that planted corn this past year probably experienced some disappointments, and so I wanted to go through some of the explanations of why that happened, and then follow into the 2017 season and why I don't think that we're going to have those same challenges. We're probably going to have different ones, but to kind of give you some ideas as you start making your cropping plans. So the first thing we've got to look at for the 2016 growing season is that it was a season of ups and downs. We all remember the heat that we had right there in July, but what many people don't remember is how cool and wet we were early on to get that crop started. And I think that was kind of the start of our problems. We didn't go out and really allow our corn crop to root down deep because of that cool, wet soil moisture. Some guys were mudding things in, had compacted seed beds and things like that, which really kind of started the problem. As we rock along through the season, you know, like you see, quite a few ups and downs. This information was pulled from one of our test plots in Floyd County. And as we start getting into this critical time period, so we've got several hybrids here and different growth stages as we move through the crop development. As we get into that most critical time period there around the tassel time frame, we hit that extreme heat. So extreme heat coupled with that shallow rooting system, we weren't able to tap into that deeper moisture, and therefore we started seeing some issues happening. You know, if we had excessive amounts of irrigation, which is very rare in these parts, we might have been able to make our way through there. But, you know, looking back, we probably should have made some adjustments with how we were applying that irrigation. And then we roll out here to the end of the season, things start cooling back off, and then we get some rainfall, which I'll show in the next slide. Well, yep. So really what a lot of guys encountered was some ear molds and some things that we haven't really seen out here in 25 plus years. And really that's some of those stresses that we had early in the season or around that tassel time frame with that heat. We also noticed that hybrids that had poor husk cover or their husk cover was affected because of the droughty conditions there around tassel really opened it up to incubate those fusarium spores and other spores here late in the season whenever we got those September rains. And so really those two things combined was kind of created a perfect storm, which therefore created some major issues that we had to deal with. Another thing with fusarium that we've found is that thrips actually cause some issues. So, you know, we thought we'd kind of gotten by that in our cotton crop, but we're starting to find out that whenever we had that significant amount of heat, we were drying down CRP, drying down wheat acres, and the thrips moved into those ears, and they started making little nicks on the kernels, and then that creates an opportunity for that fusarium to move into that kernel. And like I said, the last thing is that late August, mid-September rain events really brought in some prime conditions to take those diseases and make them incubate and cause us problems at harvest. So just giving you some ideas of what we were dealing with, and hopefully we won't have those same issues. Hopefully Mr. Bledsoe's right, so we'll keep hopeful for that going into 17. Another thing that I noticed was looking at planting date, how our yields were affected. And typically we plant around here from the middle of May or April till the 1st of May for most of our planted crop. And most of the time that's when things work out well. But this year it was quite different. If you got your crop in early, in that early April time frame, we typically didn't see many issues. But as we move further into April and then into the 1st of May, that's where our yields were significantly dampened, mostly because that drought stress that we saw right around tassel, and then also that provided infection points for the fusarium and other ear molds to set in. As we get out there past the middle of May and some late planted crops, we actually had some pretty significant yield advantages there. And so just something to think about looking back on last year and maybe why we had some of the issues that we did. Hopefully we're not going to have those this year. So some of the things that we learned looking at corn production from 2016 is that the guys that reduced their planting rates, and really kind of the sweet spot was in that 28 to 32,000 range, allowed us to move more air through that canopy, cool that canopy. We also get a benefit by reducing our input cost a little bit. But the guys that were in that range tended to have a little better luck. As we moved higher in populations, we had a denser canopy, hotter nighttime temperatures, and really there was nowhere for that heat to escape, and just created a really weird microclimate as we were going through the season. That coupled with our poor planting conditions, that shallow root system, we weren't able to tap into that 3rd and 4th foot with most of our root systems, as well as tapping into some of the nutrients that we'd placed out there as well. So just some things to think about as we look back on 2016 and start making some plans. So I'm going to cover just some basics in corn water use as we move into the rest of this presentation, and really think about why do plants use water? Well, number one is to provide plant structure. We've got to be able to hold that plant up, reach for the stars, and get something out of it. That plant also uses water to regulate its temperature, and we've got to have water moving through the plant throughout the entire day to be able to regulate that temperature, especially whenever it gets hot, because we're transpiring, and keep that plant moving. And then the last thing is we've got to move the nutrients. We've got to, we're tapping into those nitrogen particles that are down in the soil, as well as other fertilizer particles. And the only way that we can move that is through water. So very critical to the life of a plant, especially in a corn crop. So there's a couple of things as we look into evapotranspiration. And we've talked about ET a lot today and over the years. And really there's 3 main components as we think about a corn crop. The number one in this area is wind. Every time that the wind blows more than it should, we're moving that boundary layer off and creating that plant, or making that plant have to transpire more to keep it cool. So something that we've got to, there's not much that we can do about it, but it goes into the calculation as we work through ET calculations. Heat is the next factor, and that helps us get to our different developmental stages, but it also can be a hindrance, especially whenever we're above that 95-degree mark. That plant just can't keep up. It starts burning up reserves, and it takes longer for it to recover over the course of the night. And then the last thing is vegetative mass, and just thinking about if we over-irrigate early, we build a big old plant, and then we come into that critical time period around tassel, and we've got to take care of this plant. We probably don't have enough irrigation capacity to do that. And this year we didn't tap down into that 3rd and 4th foot like we should have. And so we've got a big old plant to take care of. And so thinking about how we manage our irrigation, looking at our ET replacement, if we do some smart things at the front end of the season, maybe we don't build as big a plant, it's easier to take care of in the season, and we're still seeing significant yield increases, plus we've saved some water that we probably could have saved from the front. So there's 2 components to evapotranspiration, and this is with any crop. But looking at a corn crop, we really figured that evaporation is probably 20 to 30% of that equation, and transpiration is 70 to 80% of that equation. So kind of how that breaks out, early in the season, we've got small plants out there, but we've got a lot of bare ground because we haven't closed our canopy. So that evaporation to transpiration ratio is weighted heavier on the evaporation piece. So we need to think about that as we start planning our irrigations. We don't need to replace a whole lot because that plant's not using a whole lot, but we need to make sure that we're utilizing some of these technologies that we've talked about with drop nozzles and things like that, where we're not wetting the entire surface, we're only wetting a small band, and we don't have that evaporation. Utilizing crop residue, with rotations. Leaving that residue out there will help with that evaporation piece, so something to consider. And then also, as we narrow our row spacings, we can get to that canopy closure quite a bit quicker. So, there's other things to consider, looking at different planting dates, different planting hybrids, as well as planting rates. So, the thicker planted that we are looking at early in the season, maybe we can close that evaporation gap a little quicker. As we move later in the season, we switch gears and move to more transpiration. As that plant grows, it's using more water to cool itself, to keep itself up, and also we're going through the middle of the summer where we've got a lot of heat and wind loads on that plant. So the more efficient that we can be with our irrigation and the more smart that we can be planting the crop that we're putting into the ground should help us to maximize that ET rate. So thinking through corn water use, we all know that the most critical time is right there around tassel. Typically, as a general statement, I say 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. We want to make sure that we prevent any stress during that time frame, and part of that's what we do early in the season. We want to make sure that we've got roots tapped down deep to extract that moisture whenever it does get hot, because we probably don't have the irrigation capacities to keep up with crop demand. Yield loss can occur anytime during the growing season, but there are a couple of times that we can get by with it a little easier than others. Typically that's on the front side and on the back side of the growing season. So why do we irrigate? Well, number one is to satisfy those plant requirements, give it what it needs so that we can grow and we can capture yield off of it. But that can be a blessing and a curse depending on how we go about it. If we put too much on, we've pushed the oxygen out of the soil, the roots don't have the ability to go grow like they should, and we end up starving that plant off, and then whenever we hit a stressful time, we're not able to tap into those deep reserves. If our soil is too dry, then we've got other issues because that root is not going to go through dry soil. So we want to make sure that we stay above that 50% depletable amount. So we want to make sure that we match our irrigation needs to our crop plan. And early in the season, we're not using much. Middle of the season, we're using a lot, and then we tail off after that. And so we want to make sure that we match our amounts to that point. Scott talked about this a little bit as far as the yield increase with additional water, and so I've kind of put some dollars and cents to it. And really, the two major crops that we grow around are cotton and corn, and looking at that value of the inch of water that you put on there based on the average amount that we are going to get from that additional water. You can see sorghum down here in the bottom. Now, I didn't figure in any kind of other things like what it would cost to plant this crop or fertilize it or things like that, but just to kind of give you an idea as you start making cropping plans, where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck for that inch of water that I've got available for the crop? So let's think back, start thinking about 2017, how we're shaping up and what kind of things that we can start making plans. So just a little review of our crop growth and development. There's really 4 critical times in that plant's life. First one is emergence. We've got to get a good uniform stand, so slow those planters down. Let's get those plants emerged within 24 hours of each other so that we can give them all a equal chance to go up and give us some return later on in the season. Now, crop water needs are not very high during this early point in time, and we may need to hold off some irrigations. In my experience, it's very difficult to build a profile early in the season, and typically, especially dealing with a corn plant, we're sending the wrong signal that, hey, everything's going to be fine, and then all of a sudden we cut its knees out from underneath it at tassel time because we've sent the signal that, hey, I've got plenty of water. All of a sudden we turn around, we don't. The next critical time is this V6 period, or really kind of V5 to V7, so kind of boot top high. That's when we're determining those rows around. And this is a genetic component, but it's also very highly variable based on the environment that we put it in. So we want to make sure that we've got adequate moisture at that point so that we can capture the genetic potential, and also start thinking about applying some fertilizer into the season to carry it through that rapid growth phase, which is going to happen next. As we get into tassel, that's obviously the most critical time, those 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. We want to make sure that we've got adequate moisture. We want to make sure that we've got deep moisture to tap into. And we also want to think about some nitrogen needs there, as the crop is probably only used about 65–70% of its nitrogen. Many of these hybrids are taking up nitrogen later on into the season. And so I recommend thinking in this R1 stage and beyond to apply a little bit of nitrogen and make sure that we keep our irrigation needs rocking and rolling. Thinking back to some corn physiology, and I stole this from the Lindsay Corn Management Guide, but looking at where is our water extracted from in a corn plant. Well, it's kind of a rule of 4-3-2-1. So let's say we had a 4-foot soil profile, 25% or in the top 25%. So the top foot, we're going to take up 40% of our water and nutrients. As we dip into that second foot, we're going to add an additional 30% of uptake, and really that's where we want to make sure that we've got water and nutrients placed in that zone, because that's where the biggest bang for our buck is. As we get closer to tassel, we start reaching the rooting depth potentials that we've allowed that plant to have. That's kind of the bank that we want to work on, this last 30%, which is in that third and fourth foot. That's going to carry you through those that highest water demand time to be able to satisfy some of those needs that we aren't able to apply through irrigation. I mentioned earlier there are times that we can stress this plant. We're going to see a yield reduction no matter when we stress it, but there's some times that we can probably skate by. And typically that's in that early vegetative stage, so basically from the time you get it established till about that V5 or that boot top stage. We want to make sure that crop roots down and really is able to tap into that moisture. As we move into tassel emergence, silk emergence, those are our biggest drivers of loss if we short that crop. And then as we get past dough, we start getting back into these 5 to 10% loss ratios. The good thing is, typically during that time of year, we're starting to catch some rainfalls, our temperatures are cooling down, and our humidities are coming up. So, really, if I was going to stress a corn plant, I want to do it on the early end and the backside. So I did I looked at some weather forecasting sites recently and wanted to kind of get an idea, okay, if we look at the corn water use curve and what's forecasted to happen here over the next growing season, what is that going to look like? Where are we going to be at in those critical time periods? And so looking at an April 15th planted corn crop, looking at 113-day maturity, we start that crop off, we're going to be kind of a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit drier, which is not a bad thing. That typically tells that plant, hey, we need to tap those, send those roots down as far as we can. So that's really a good thing whenever we have a growing season that starts off that way. As we move into some of the more critical time periods, we're going to have some of those flashes of some warm weather. We're going to have some periodic rainfall events in there, at least is how it's forecasted. But as we get into that critical time period for an April planted crop, it looks like we're going to cool down from what it has been normal, and don't pay a whole lot of attention to the colors as much as just the trends that we're looking at. These are a couple of degrees cooler. Looks like we're going to have a little more rainfall happening in that time frame, and so we're setting ourselves up differently than we did last year. We're going to have we should have a very favorable environment to grow an early planted crop, and then as we finish out the crop, coming down on our water use, we're still in that cooler, wetter period, and then as we get into the late stages of that corn crop starting to dry out, really favorable for that grain fill period because we are going to be a little bit warmer, a little bit drier to allow you to get into that field and get it knocked out. As we move to a May 10th planting scenario, we kind of got about the same situation. We're going to be warmer and drier on the early end of things, so allowing us to establish that crop. As we move into those more critical time periods, we're going to be slightly cooler than we have been the last couple of years, as well as maybe even some chances of rain to help us out. As we get through with that critical time period, we are going to warm up, so we want to make sure that we've got adequate irrigation out there to fill this grain out. And then as we move to the end of the season, we should have a favorable event to dry that corn down and really pack the starch into that grain. Then the final one is looking at a June 1st planting, and a little bit different scenario here. Looks like we're going to be coming off of that warmer, wetter weather and cooling down here early in the season. So we may want to make sure that we adjust some of our irrigation strategies to make sure that we're driving that moisture deeper into the soil. So we don't want to over-irrigate something that's happening here in June. As we look at this critical time period, we've kind of split it right in half. The first part of that, as we move into tassel, is looking like it may be a little cooler and a little wetter. As we move into after pollination, it's going to warm up and less rainfall. So we want to make sure that we plan accordingly, that we've planted those acres with the amount of moisture that we can apply to it. And then as we tail off into the season, looks like as we get into that October time frame, things are going to start cooling down significantly. So we may not want to look at 113 day. We may want to look at something more in the 100 to 108, maybe 110 day range, so that we can move some of these, shift some of these things over to the left. So just some things to think about. Forecast, but at least it gives you something to plan with, and we can make adjustments to it from there. So some strategies for success. We've talked a lot about water balance and ET scheduling and things like that. I think that having that approach with this crop will be critical. We want to make sure that we match that irrigation need to the crop stage, and we want to start off with a good soil profile. Hopefully Mother Nature will help us out, but be prepared to add a couple of inches there at the start of the season to get that thing off to a good start. As we move into the growing season, we want to make sure that we're tapping into that root zone and taking full effect of that full 4-5 foot. Account for our precipitation and adjust our irrigation methods to it. We don't want to over irrigate this crop, because in many cases we're doing more harm than we're doing good. We're sealing off that ground. We're keeping oxygen out of there. We're pushing our nutrients below that root zone, and we're not able to tap into those things. So the ET scheduling approach works for this crop, and I'd encourage you to use the tools that are available. The next thing, I mentioned earlier about rooting depth, and that these newer hybrids that we've brought out are taking up, or actually growing those roots past the tassel time frame, and we found this by putting moisture probes out there. But this graph just depicts, where we're at. So we've got pretty shallow roots. We're not using a whole lot of water over here on the water uptake. As we get into, V6 stage, we're looking at putting those rows around. From that point till about V12, we're determining how long that ear is going to be, but we're continuing to grow that plant. Our water needs are increasing, and so we want to match our irrigations to be able to replace that. As we get into tassel, we start seeing some, these roots tapping into the second and third and fourth foot, and that's a good thing, because that's going to give us a little bank to work off of if we step into a stressful situation. And then as we move off into the end of the year, we want to make sure that we utilize that water that we've got available, both above ground and below ground, and then start drying that thing down for harvest and use up every bit that we put out there and not leave any around, so that we can capture some more this winter. Really water in the root zone is the thing that is what we're trying to look at and measure, and there's multiple options out there to be able to do that. One other thing as we start making plans for 2017 is just being realistic with what kind of water you've got, and also your yield expectations. And so we kind of put together a graph here looking at different gallons per minute, and depending on your elevation, where you would be. And this column here is giving you an idea of how many inches of irrigation it would take. But looking at a 3 gallon a minute pivot, there's no reason to think that you're going to make 200 bushels with that. We're probably going to be in that 140 range, depending on what kind of precipitation that we get. As we move to 4 or 5 gallons a minute, that yield expectation rises. And so maybe we just need to reduce some of the acres that we're looking at, so that we can take care of that crop during that critical time period. So I'll put up a center pivot precipitation chart, and looking at gallons per minute and then what you'd be applying weekly, or if you care to look at it daily. For us to satisfy, a corn plant's needs, that 6 gallons a minute is going to do everything that you need. So, many cases we don't have that amount of water on a quarter-mile system, so maybe we need to reduce that acreage down to 60 acres or 40 acres so that whenever we do get to that critical time period, that we're able to keep up with the water demand. And I've talked in the past about some different split planting scenarios. If you kept your corn on the early side and maybe your cotton a little bit later where you're trying to do this, then you'd be able to balance that out and use that 6 gallons a minute on both crops if you step that out correctly. I get a lot of questions on corn pre-watering guidelines, and really basically, if you got less water, you need to put quite a bit out, no matter what kind of soil type that you've got. But as your irrigation capacity increases, and depending on your soil type, it doesn't take as many inches to fill that up from 50% to say 85%. So be smart, go out and stick a probe in the ground, find out what you've got, and start making a plan to build a profile to start with, because it'll pay off in the end. So a couple other things, and people have talked about this during the day, but just looking at how we apply that water. This is a field that we looked at in 2011 where we were looking at the difference between using bubblers and using Lisa, and 50 bushel difference between that, and it all boils down to we were pushing that water deeper, able to tap into it. We weren't evaporating it like we were with the Lisa, and so something to consider once you get that crop established, flipping those pads over and starting to run that out in basically a band situation. There's several things that we can do to be able to tap in to figure out what we got to start the season. And, something as simple as a rod sticking in the ground to give you an idea, okay, where is that moisture at? Going out with a soil probe and actually doing the hand feel method to figure out, okay, where are we at different depths, and do I have enough moisture out there to get this crop started? I just put a couple of examples up here, but, maybe it's watermark sensors or gypsum blocks or something to give you an idea what's happening under the ground. And then, the automated soil probes and the programs that go along with that could kind of give you a hands-off approach, able to look at things from your convenience of your pickup or your house to be able to determine where are my roots at, where's that water going, and how do I make adjustments throughout the growing season. The last thing that I really want to cover here is just looking at variable rate irrigation, and I think there's several applications that may work out here. As we look at these half pivot scenarios or partial pivot scenarios, we may want to look at a variable rate prescription to be able to address that. In many cases, what we end up doing is overwatering the ends because we're doubling back, and we kind of leave the middle out to fend for itself. And 2 years ago, we looked at what this would look like if we just did 1.5 inches every time we went across it. And we saw a 26 bushel difference between the north side and the south side because we were overwatering one side and kind of leaving the other out. So maybe a variable rate prescription could help us manage through some of these scenarios. If you had another crop on the other side, we'd be able to do the exact same thing. So something to consider as we start looking into 2017. Just looking at variable rate irrigation on its own, fairly cheap way to get into this space. But we all know that the southwest side of that field is taking on the most wind and the most heat. So maybe we slow those pivots down a little bit on that side of the pivot to put down more water. There's several different strategies that we can look at there. For the guys that are variable rate seeding, we can build up a variable rate prescription for those scenarios, and really, if you're going to variable rate your seed, why would you put the same amount of water out there as you did on the high population? We want to also adjust our irrigation amounts so that we're not wasting anything out there and being smart with our water. So, maybe these are some things that we want to start considering as we look into ways to manage our crop going forward. The last thing is just better return on our inputs, and we've talked about that with water, matching to your crop growth stage, building that profile, digging those roots deep. But within corn, there's also nitrogen management strategies that go hand in hand, and really it's the same concept. As when that plant's young, we're not using as much fertility, and we don't need to have a whole lot out there because we're just opening ourselves up for leaching opportunities. So splitting those applications out, and there's quite a few methods. With a pivot, it's pretty easy to go out there and match it up. 65% of that nitrogen uptake happens from the time it emerges till it tassels, and then we found that adding another 30, 50, 60 units after it tassels helps us not only with plant health but also filling that grain out. So there's different strategies looking at some of these opportunities to lay that fertility out in a stream right at the base of the plant, or pumping it through your pivot. So we want to be smart with what we've got. This is a time with tight margins, and if we can improve that nitrogen use efficiency from a 1.2 or 1.1 per bushel and down into that 0.7 range, we've saved a lot of money, we've made more yield, and then couple that with your irrigation. So appreciate the time, and if there's time for questions, I'll take it. Otherwise, I'll be around the rest of the day.